in a Brooklyn social club in the late 1980s. Tough mobsters who had killed without thinking twice, who kept secrets that could destroy lives, did something unusual when Thomas Pitera walked through the door. They all turned to look at him, every single one, because nobody wanted their back to Tommy Karate. These were official members of the Bonanno crime family. They feared almost nothing, except him. Tommy Pitera wasn't just a hired killer. He was a martial arts expert who trained for years in Japan. A Bonanno soldier suspected of 60 murders. A man who didn't just kill, he cut his victims into pieces with expert skill, burying heads away from bodies in a secret Staten Island burial site to hide their identities forever. And the most disturbing part? He once sat naked in a bathtub with a dead body, calmly cutting it apart, not for work, but because he liked it. This is the complete story of Tommy Karate, the bullied Brooklyn kid with a high-pitched voice who became the Mafia's most terrifying killer. A serial murderer hiding in plain sight, protected by the mob, who studied death like art and enjoyed it. If you're ready for one of the darkest true crime stories in mob history, the beginning, the terror, the horrible discoveries, and the trial that locked him away forever, stay with me. By the end, you'll wonder, what creates a monster like Tommy Pitera? And how did the Mafia allow him to continue? Before we start this dark journey, I want to know, where in the world are you watching from? Write your city and country in the comments. What time is it for you right now? Are you listening at 3 o'clock a.m. when you can't sleep, during your drive, or maybe while working? If you enjoy these detailed true crime stories about real mobsters and their brutal actions, make sure you subscribe and turn on notifications. We have many more stories like this coming. And if you appreciate the research and detail in these videos, leave a like. It helps us reach more people who love this content as much as you do. Now let's enter the twisted world of Tommy Karate. Thomas Pitera was born on December 2, 1954, in Gravesend, Brooklyn, a neighborhood that would become known for organized crime. Gravesend was a close Italian-American community where everyone knew everyone, where families had lived for many years, where the line between legal business and mob activity was always unclear. It was a neighborhood of social clubs where men in expensive suits ran businesses that were never written down anywhere. It was a place where certain names commanded instant respect, where whispers of "he's connected" could open doors or end conversations. Into this world came Tommy Pitera, the son of Joseph Pitera and Catherine Buseschi. His father, Joseph, was an honest Italian immigrant from Campania in the province of Salerno, a small town in the Campania region of southern Italy. Joseph had come to America seeking the same dream that had brought millions across the ocean, a chance at a better life, an opportunity to build something for his family. He worked as a wholesale candy salesman, a legal businessman who worked long hours, who followed the rules, who wanted nothing to do with the shadowy figures who controlled his neighborhood. Joseph Pitera was a good man, a working man, the kind of immigrant who represented the American ideal of honest work and slow success. Tommy's mother, Catherine, came from completely different background. She was of German and Polish heritage, her family coming from the Rhineland-Palatinate region of Germany before moving to America. The marriage between Joseph and Catherine represented a common mixing of European backgrounds in the great melting pot of New York City. They were, by all accounts, an ordinary working-class family. Tommy had a sister named Teresa. The family lived simply but comfortably. Joseph worked hard to provide. There was food on the table, a home over their heads, and the general expectation that life would continue in its expected working-class way. Nothing in Tommy's early childhood suggested the monster he would become. There was no early violence, no hurting of animals, none of the classic warning signs that experts look for in developing psychopaths. He was simply a quiet boy, perhaps a bit shy, perhaps a bit different, growing up in the shadow of Brooklyn's organized crime culture. But then came the teenage years, and with them, the bullying. David A. Booty Junior High School in Gravesend became Tommy Pitera's personal nightmare. From the moment he hit puberty, Tommy had a distinctive feature that made him an instant target: his voice. It wasn't just high-pitched, it was a distinctive falsetto. Feminine and jarring, often compared to Michael Jackson's speaking voice. But somehow higher, more noticeable. Some who heard it said it reminded them of Mickey Mouse. Others described it as a cartoon character brought to life. Agents who would later interview him compared it to Richard Widmark's character, Tommy Udo, in the 1947 film, Kiss of Death. Except, they said scarier. There was something unsettling about hearing such a voice come from a teenage boy. Something that immediately marked him as different, as other. As prey in the brutal social world of a 1960s Brooklyn junior high school. Different meant weak, and weak meant targeted. The bullying was constant, systematic, and cruel in the way that only teenage cruelty can be. Tommy was called names, daily insults hurled at him in hallways. In the cafeteria, in the locker room, the boys laughed at him. But perhaps more devastating for a teenage boy, the girls laughed too. There was no safe place. No corner of the school where he could escape the mockery. The laughter followed him like a shadow. But it wasn't just verbal. The bullying turned physical. Tommy was slapped, kicked, shoved into lockers. Other students would spit on him. He was tripped in hallways. His books were knocked from his hands. In gym class, he was always picked last, and even then, his teammates would groan in exaggerated disappointment. The physical abuse was frequent enough that Tommy began to connect school with pain, with shame, with a daily challenge of degradation that he had to survive. The psychological impact was deep for a sensitive teenage boy, and despite what he would become, young Tommy was sensitive. This daily ritual of shame destroyed something inside him. Psychologists who have studied Tommy's case later point to this period as possibly crucial. The constant attacks on his manhood, the attacks on his identity during the important years when identity is being formed, likely created deep psychological wounds. More importantly, it may have created a burning need to prove himself, to transform himself into something that could never be mocked. Never be hurt, never be weak again. Tommy tried to fit in. He wanted desperately to be accepted, to be normal, to be one of the guys. He loved baseball and wanted to join the varsity team. Baseball was America's pastime, the sport that connected boys to their fathers, that created friendships, that gave you status. But Tommy was too rejected, too marked as an outsider. The other boys didn't want him. The coaches, reading the social situation, didn't push for his inclusion. His dream of being part of the team died before it could even begin. And that's when something changed inside Tommy Pitera. Unable to join the baseball team, unable to be accepted, young Tommy decided to take revenge in the only way his teenage mind could think of. He broke into the school and stole the baseball team's equipment: bats, gloves, balls, uniforms, everything he could carry. Then he sold it all to local criminals, the neighborhood criminals who asked no questions about where things came from. It was a small crime, the act of an angry, hurt teenager lashing out at the system that had rejected him. But it was also Tommy's first taste of the criminal world, his first step toward the life that would eventually consume him. He was arrested as a teenager. His record was sealed, as teenage records typically are, giving him a chance to start fresh. But the damage was done. Tommy had learned that he could strike back, that he wasn't powerless, and that there was a whole world of men in his neighborhood: mobsters, criminals, tough guys who commanded the respect he craved. These men weren't mocked. These men weren't laughed at. These men were feared. And Tommy Pitera decided that he too would become something to be feared. Tommy's transformation started with an obsession. Like many boys growing up in the 1960s, he became fascinated with martial arts. But for Tommy, it wasn't a passing interest or a casual hobby. It became an all-consuming passion, a pathway to reinvention, a way of transforming himself from victim to victor. The catalyst was television in 1966. The Green Hornet premiered on a BC featuring Bruce Lee as Kato, the Green Hornet's martial arts expert sidekick for American audiences, many of whom had never seen real martial arts before. Bruce Lee was a revelation. His speed, his power, his grace, it was unlike anything they had witnessed. He moved like water, struck like lightning. He was compact, powerful, and absolutely deadly. And importantly for Tommy Pitera, Bruce Lee wasn't a giant. He wasn't a hulking brute. He was 5 feet 7 inches and 140 pounds, proving that size didn't matter if you had skill, speed, and technique. Tommy watched every episode of The Green Hornet. He studied Bruce Lee's movements, his philosophy, his intensity. He saw in Lee something he desperately wanted for himself, the transformation from underdog to warrior. Bruce Lee himself had been bullied as a child in Hong Kong, had faced discrimination in America, but had transformed himself into perhaps the most respected martial artist in the world. If Bruce Lee could do it, Tommy reasoned, so could he. Tommy began training at a local dojo in Sheepshead Bay, Brooklyn. At first, he was just another kid in a white uniform, learning basic stances and punches. But Tommy was different from the other students. For them, martial arts was fun, a sport, something to do after school. For Tommy, it was salvation. It was the answer to every humiliation he had suffered. Every punch he learned was revenge on the boys who had hit him. Every kick was power he had never possessed. Every technique was a step away from the weak, high-voiced boy everyone mocked. His training became obsessive. He worked out daily, spending hours in the dojo and then more hours at home. He lifted weights, transforming his slight frame into something harder, more muscular. He studied fighting strategies, reading everything he could find about martial arts, combat, warfare. He watched violent films obsessively, particularly kung fu movies that were becoming increasingly popular in American theaters. Films like Five Fingers of Death and The Chinese Boxer played in grindhouse theaters throughout Brooklyn, and Tommy was there for every showing, absorbing the choreography, the philosophy, the mystique. But more than the physical training, Tommy absorbed something else from martial arts culture, the philosophy of the warrior. Traditional martial arts weren't just about fighting, they were about discipline, about control, about becoming more than you were. The samurai code, Bushido, emphasized honor, loyalty, and the willingness to face death without fear. For Tommy, these concepts weren't just interesting, they were life-changing. He began to see himself not as a victim, not as a bullied kid, but as a warrior in training. Every insult was a test. Every physical attack was an opportunity to grow stronger. The bullying didn't stop immediately, but Tommy's response to it changed. He began fighting back, and he discovered something crucial. He was good at it. In 1974, when Tommy was 20 years old, an opportunity arose that would change his life forever. A brutal karate tournament was being held in Sheepshead Bay, the kind of full-contact competition that was becoming popular in the era before mixed martial arts, but reflected the same basic appeal: real combat, real consequences. This wasn't the point sparring of traditional tournaments. This was kumite, a term popularized by martial arts films, referring to full-contact fighting where competitors actually struck each other with the intention of causing damage. Tommy entered the tournament. It was risky. He could be seriously hurt, could be humiliated again in front of an audience. But it was also an opportunity to prove himself, to show that he was no longer the weak kid who got pushed around at David A. Booty Junior High School. The tournament was structured as a series of matches, and Tommy had to face 7 opponents to win, and he destroyed them one by one, using the techniques he had drilled for countless hours, channeling years of rage and humiliation into focused violence. Tommy dismantled his competition. He was fast, technical, and possessed something his opponents lacked: a complete absence of fear. When you've been beaten down as much as Tommy had, when you've suffered as much psychological and physical abuse, a few more punches don't matter. He fought with the intensity of someone who had nothing to lose and everything to prove. He won. And the prize was extraordinary: a year-long scholarship to study martial arts in Japan. For most people, this would be an interesting opportunity, a chance to train in the birthplace of karate, to experience another culture. For Tommy Pitera, it was a pilgrimage. Japan wasn't just a country, it was the source, the wellspring of the warrior culture he had come to worship. This was where the samurai had lived and died by their code. This was where martial arts had been refined over centuries. This was where he could become what he had always wanted to be. In early 1975, Tommy arrived in Tokyo. The city must have been overwhelming for a 20-year-old from Brooklyn who had never traveled abroad. Tokyo was massive, modern, utterly foreign. The language barrier alone would have stopped many Americans. But Tommy wasn't there to sightsee or to socialize. He was there to train. He found his way to a dojo run by Shihan Hiroshi Masimi, a respected master of Togakuru, a school of Koga ninjutsu. This was a significant detail that would later be lost in the mythology surrounding Tommy. He didn't actually study karate in Japan, he studied ninjutsu, the martial art associated with ninja, the legendary covert agents and assassins of feudal Japan. While modern ninjutsu is primarily practiced as a martial art form, its historical roots were in spying, sabotage, guerrilla warfare, and assassination. Tommy was drawn to these darker aspects of the art. Shihan Masumi was a demanding instructor, and the training was brutal. Tommy learned to fight with various weapons: tanfa, a handled club; nunchaku, the two-stick weapon popularized by Bruce Lee; and katanas, Japanese swords. The physical training was punishing, designed to build not just strength, but endurance and pain tolerance. Students were expected to train through injuries, to push past normal human limits. The philosophy was simple: in a real fight, you don't get to stop because you're tired or hurt. You fight until you win or until you die. But Tommy thrived in this environment. The structure, the discipline, the clear hierarchy all appealed to him. In Japan, he wasn't the weird kid with the funny voice. He was a dedicated student, and dedication was respected. For perhaps the first time in his life, Tommy felt he belonged somewhere. He grew his hair long, down to his shoulders. In imitation of Bruce Lee, he adopted Japanese mannerisms and customs. He studied samurai history obsessively, reading about famous warriors and their codes of honor. The samurai concept of dying with honor particularly fascinated him, the idea that how you faced death was as important as how you lived. When his year-long scholarship ended, Tommy refused to go home. He got a job at a chopsticks factory, menial work that allowed him to stay in Japan and continue training. He remained in Tokyo for 27 months total. Over 2 years of immersion in martial arts culture and Japanese philosophy. His mother, Catherine, and his aunt, Angelina, visited him during this period, curious to see how he was doing. They were impressed by his physical transformation. The slight, bullied boy had been replaced by a man of rock-solid muscle. Disciplined and focused, he seemed to have found his path. When Tommy finally returned to Brooklyn in 1976, he was completely transformed physically. He was unrecognizable from the kid who had left. He was built, muscular, moving with the confidence and economy of motion that comes from years of intensive martial arts training. He carried himself differently, back straight, head up, eyes that now met others directly rather than looking away. The bullied kid was gone. In his place was something harder, more dangerous. But the psychological transformation was more profound and far more troubling. Tommy hadn't just learned to fight in Japan. He had absorbed a warrior philosophy that emphasized strength, honor, and the acceptance of violence as a tool. More troubling, he had developed an intense fascination with death itself, not as something to fear, but as something to understand, to control, to inflict. The samurai studied death to overcome their fear of it. Tommy studied death for different reasons. Something dark had taken root inside him during those years in Tokyo. Something that had been planted by years of abuse and humiliation and had now found purpose and direction. Tommy returned to Gravesend, to the same streets he had left. But he was no longer the same person, and the neighborhood was about to find out just how much he had changed. Gravesend in the mid-1970s was Mafia territory. The Bonanno crime family, one of New York's 5 families, had a strong presence in the neighborhood. Social clubs lined the streets, supposedly places where Italian men gathered to play cards, drink espresso, and socialize. In reality, these clubs were the nerve centers of criminal operations. Drugs were discussed here. Murders were ordered from these smoky back rooms. Money changed hands, always in cash, never recorded. Young men who frequented these clubs could see the tangible rewards of the life. Expensive cars, beautiful women, pockets always full of cash, and most importantly, respect. When a made man walked down the street, people showed respect. They said hello. They got out of the way. They didn't laugh. Tommy started hanging around these social clubs and local bars where mobsters gathered. He was drawn to them like a moth to flame. These were the men who commanded the respect he had always craved. These were the neighborhood's warriors, the modern equivalent of the samurai he had studied in Japan. They lived by a code omerta, the Mafia's code of silence and loyalty. They faced death without fear. They took what they wanted. And no one, absolutely no one, bullied them at first. Tommy was just another neighborhood kid hanging around the edges, hoping to be noticed, but his reputation preceded him. Word had spread that Tommy had spent years in Japan studying martial arts, that he had won a full contact tournament, that he was dangerous with his hands and with weapons. In the mob world, such skills were valuable. Strong arm work was a constant need. Collections, intimidation, enforcement. A guy who could handle himself in a fight was always useful. Tommy earned the nickname Tommy Karate, though technically it was inaccurate since he had studied ninjutsu rather than karate. But the nickname stuck because it perfectly captured his unique skill set. In a world of tough guys, Tommy was something different, a martial arts expert, disciplined and deadly in ways that street fighters weren't. His reputation grew through demonstration. When challenges arose, when someone needed to be taught a lesson, Tommy was willing and capable. His high-pitched voice, which had once made him a target for mockery, now had a different effect. Hearing that distinctive falsetto combined with watching Tommy systematically dismantle someone created cognitive dissonance that was deeply unsettling. The voice suggested weakness. The actions demonstrated lethal competence. The contrast made him memorable and increasingly feared. Tommy formed a close friendship with Anthony Bruno Indelicato, and this relationship would prove crucial to his future in organized crime. Bruno was the son of Alphonse "Sonny Red" Indelicato, a powerful captain in the Bonanno family. Bruno himself was a MAID member, a full-fledged soldier in the organization, and he had earned his position through his willingness to kill. Bruno was a stone-cold killer with a serious cocaine habit. In the Mafia's traditional rules, drug use, particularly cocaine, was supposed to be prohibited, especially among MAID members. The logic was sound. Drug users became unpredictable, unreliable, and vulnerable to law enforcement pressure. They talked too much, spent too recklessly, and couldn't be trusted with sensitive information. But Bruno Indelicato got a pass on his cocaine use for 2 reasons. First, his father was a powerful captain, and family connections mattered in the Mafia. Second, and more importantly, Bruno was a reliable killer. When he was given a contract, the target ended up dead. In the mob's cold calculation, A killer who used cocaine was more valuable than a clean-living member who couldn't handle violent work. Bruno's drug habit was overlooked because his killing ability was undeniable. Through Bruno, Tommy was introduced to the inner workings of the Bonanno family. He began doing work for the family initially, nothing major. Just errands, collections, showing up to provide muscle when needed. But he was being evaluated, tested, observed. The Bonanno leadership was always looking for reliable earners and capable soldiers. Tommy showed promise. More importantly, he showed enthusiasm for the violent aspects of the work that many associates tried to avoid. When violence was needed, Tommy didn't hesitate. He didn't show reluctance or moral concerns, he simply acted. Efficiently and without apparent emotion. This was exactly what the family valued. The Bonanno family in the late 1970s and early 1980s was in turmoil. Internal conflicts, always simmering beneath the surface of organized crime families, had reached a breaking point. The family was essentially split into two factions, each maneuvering for control, each viewing the other as a threat to their power and prosperity. These weren't ideological differences or business disputes that could be resolved through negotiation. This was about power, pure and simple, and in the Mafia, such conflicts had only one resolution: violence. On one side was the official leadership, Philip "Rusty" Rustelli, the official boss of the family, though he was serving a prison sentence for much of this period, and his powerful captains, Joseph Massino and Dominic "Sonny Black" Napolitano. Massino in particular was a shrewd operator, a behind-the-scenes strategist who understood that the key to Mafia success in the modern era was keeping a low profile while maximizing profits. He favored discipline, organization, and calculated violence used sparingly but effectively. On the other side was a faction of powerful captains who resented Rustelli's leadership and the growing influence of Massino. This group included Alphonse "Sonny Red" Indelicato, Bruno's father, Dominic "Big Trin" Trinchera, and Philip "Philly Lucky" Giaconi. These were old-school mobsters, men who had risen through the ranks when the Bonanno family was at its peak of power. They felt they had earned the right to control the family, and they weren't willing to accept Rustelli's authority or Massino's growing influence. Thomas Pitera, through his friendship with Bruno Indelicato, found himself aligned with the rebel faction. He was part of a crew headed by captains from the Indelicato Trinchera Giacone faction. Along with Capo Frank Lino, for Tommy, the politics were probably secondary to the opportunity. Being associated with powerful captains meant more opportunities for work, which meant more money and more respect. But it also meant he was on the wrong side of what was about to become a bloodbath. The conflict reached its climax on May 5, 1981. In an event that would become known as the Three Captains Massacre. It was a setup, carefully orchestrated by Joseph Massino and Dominic Napolitano. The three rebel captains, Sonny Red Indelicato, Big Trin Trinchera, and Philly Lucky Giaconi, were lured to a meeting at a social club in Brooklyn. The club was co-owned by Salvatore "Sammy the Bull" Gravano, who was a soldier in the Gambino family at the time, but was doing a favor for the Bonannos. The rebel captains were told this would be a sit-down, a meeting to resolve their differences. Instead, it was an ambush. As the three captains entered the club, they were immediately attacked by a hit squad that included some of the most dangerous killers in the Bonanno family. Dominic Trinchera was shot first. Philip Giaconi tried to draw his gun, but was killed before he could fire. Alphonse Indelicato, realizing what was happening, managed to get his gun out and actually fired several shots. But he was badly wounded and eventually killed. All three captains died in that social club. Their bodies later buried in various locations around New York. The massacre sent shockwaves through the Bonanno family. Bruno Indelicato, upon learning that his father had been murdered, went into hiding. Thomas Pitera, associated with the losing faction, was in serious danger. In Mafia politics, Being on the wrong side of an internal war could be a death sentence. The winners typically killed not just the leaders of the losing faction, but their most dangerous supporters as well. To prevent future retaliation, but Joseph Massino, who emerged as the real power in the family after the massacre, made a calculated decision. Rather than launch a broader war of extermination against all members of the rebel faction, he offered peace to the survivors. It was a smart move based on practical considerations. The Bonanno family had already attracted too much law enforcement attention. More bodies would mean more heat. Furthermore, the rank-and-file soldiers and associates of the rebel faction were valuable assets. They were earners, they controlled territories. They had expertise. Killing them all would weaken the family. Thomas Pitera was one of those who benefited from this pragmatic approach. He survived the internal war, and as part of Massino's peace settlement, he was formally inducted into the Bonanno family sometime in the early 1980s. Thomas Pitera was made. He became a full-fledged member of La Cosa Nostra, a soldier in the Bonanno crime family. The making ceremony is one of the Mafia's most sacred rituals. Tommy would have been brought to a secret location, probably the basement of a social club or a private home. There, surrounded by made members of the family, he would have taken the blood oath. His finger would have been pricked with a pin or needle. Drawing blood, the blood would have been smeared on a holy card, typically bearing the image of the family's patron saint. The card would then be burned while Tommy held it, reciting the oath of loyalty. "May I burn like this saint if I betray the family." He would have sworn to put the family above everything, above his own family, above the law, above his own life. He would have agreed to the Code of Omerta, the absolute prohibition against cooperating with law enforcement or testifying against fellow members. Violation of this code had only one punishment: death for Tommy. Becoming a made man was the culmination of years of work and the validation he had always sought. In the neighborhood, being made meant something. It meant protection. No one could kill you without permission from the family leadership. It meant respect. You were now part of an exclusive club with centuries of tradition. It meant opportunity. You could run your own operations, recruit your own crew, earn serious money. Tommy was assigned to a crew under Capo Franklino, who reported to the family consigliere Anthony Sparrow. This was a good position, offering both protection and autonomy. Franklino was a respected captain, well connected within the family, and his crew was involved in various lucrative operations. But Lino also gave his soldiers room to operate their own businesses, as long as they kicked up a percentage of their earnings to him. Thomas Pitera, now officially Tommy Karate of the Bonanno crime family, was ready to build his own operation, and what he built would become one of the most brutal and disturbing drug operations in New York Mafia history. The Mafia in the 1980s was undergoing a fundamental transformation. The traditional rackets that had sustained organized crime for decades, gambling, loan sharking, labor racketeering, hijacking, were still profitable, but they paled in comparison to the money that could be made in narcotics. The American appetite for cocaine was insatiable, particularly after the introduction of crack cocaine in the mid-1980s. A kilogram of cocaine purchased for a few $1,000s could be cut, processed, and sold for 10 times that amount. The profit margins were extraordinary, and the demand seemed unlimited. The Mafia's official position on drug dealing was complicated and hypocritical. The Commission, the ruling body consisting of the bosses of New York's 5 families, had technically banned drug dealing by made members. The stated reasons were both practical and moral. Drugs attracted too much law enforcement attention. Drug dealers who got caught often became informants to reduce their sentences. And there was something unseemly about poisoning your own community. But the reality was different. The ban was loosely enforced, and many powerful members of all 5 families were involved in the drug trade, either directly or by taking tribute from dealers in their territories. Tommy Pitera embraced the drug business wholeheartedly. He recognized that this was where the real money was. And money meant power. He began assembling his own crew, recruiting men who could help him build a drug operation. His crew eventually included several key players: Frank Gangi Jr., nephew of Rosario Gangi, a respected captain in the Genovese crime family. Frank's connection to a powerful family gave Tommy's operation additional protection and opened doors to suppliers and markets. Frank was ambitious, eager to make money, and willing to do whatever was necessary, including murder, to build the business. Vincent Kojak Jatano, nicknamed for his bald head, was Tommy's closest associate and most reliable enforcer. Kojak was loyal, competent, and shared Tommy's willingness to use extreme violence when necessary. He would eventually be charged alongside Tommy for multiple murders. Lorenzen Modafferi, known as Lloyd, was another key crew member involved in both drug dealing and enforcement. Lloyd was particularly useful because he had connections to Colombian drug suppliers, the source of much of the cocaine flooding into New York in the 1980s. Frank Martini rounded out the core crew, like the others. Martini was willing to do the violent work that the drug business sometimes required. Tommy's operation was sophisticated for its time. The crew dealt in multiple drugs, diversifying their product line like any successful business. They sold approximately 220 pounds of cocaine per year, massive amount representing millions of dollars in revenue. They also dealt in heroin, the drug that had traditionally been the Mafia's primary narcotic commodity, moving multiple kilograms annually. Additionally, they sold hundreds of pounds of marijuana, which had lower profit margins but steady demand and lower legal penalties if caught. But Tommy's crew didn't just buy drugs from suppliers and resell them. They also engaged in a more dangerous but more profitable business model: robbery. They would identify drug dealers, typically independent operators or small crews, who weren't connected to major crime families, and rob them. The beauty of this approach was that drug dealers couldn't go to the police. If you're robbed of illegal drugs, you can't file a police report. You either accept the loss or you seek revenge. And seeking revenge against Tommy Pitera's crew was a very dangerous proposition. One such robbery went spectacularly wrong and provided an early glimpse into both the brutality and incompetence that would characterize some of Tommy's operations. Lloyd Modafferi and Frank Martini murdered 2 Colombian drug dealers and stole 16 kilograms of cocaine, a huge score worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. But then they ran into a problem. They couldn't drive a stick shift. The Colombian's car had a manual transmission, and neither Lloyd nor Frank knew how to operate it. So they left the car with 2 dead bodies in the trunk and 16 kilos of cocaine in the vehicle, in a Brooklyn parking garage. It was an almost comically incompetent end to what should have been a perfect crime. Eventually, the car was discovered, creating a major problem that required significant cleanup and brought unwanted law enforcement attention to the crew. This incident revealed something important about Tommy's operation. It was run by violent men who were good at killing but not always smart about the broader implications of their actions. They were tactical but not strategic, focused on immediate gains without always thinking through the consequences. As the money rolled in, Tommy's reputation in the Bonanno family grew. He was proving himself to be a reliable earner, and he was kicking up appropriate percentages to his captain, Frank Leno, and through Leno to consigliere Anthony Sparrow. The family leadership was pleased. Tommy was generating revenue without attracting too much attention, and he was handling his own problems without involving the family hierarchy. This was exactly what a good soldier was supposed to do. But there was another aspect of Tommy's operation that was less visible to the family leadership. At least initially, Tommy wasn't just running a drug business. He was also indulging darker impulses, killing people not because they threatened the business, but because he wanted to, because he could. Because somewhere in his damaged psychology, Murder had become a source of satisfaction. To understand Tommy Pitera, you have to understand that he wasn't like most Mafia killers. The Mafia has always employed violence as a tool. A means to an end. You kill to protect your business, to eliminate competition, to enforce discipline, to send messages. Even the most prolific mob killers generally viewed murder as work, sometimes unpleasant work, but necessary for success in their chosen profession. Roy DeMeo, who ran the infamous DeMeo crew for the Gambino family and killed an estimated 75 to 200 people, was brutal and efficient, but witnesses said he didn't enjoy the killing itself. He enjoyed the power and money that came from being the man you called when someone needed to disappear. Tommy Pitera was different. Tommy was a psychopath who had found the perfect cover for his pathology. The Mafia gave him license to kill, protection from prosecution, and a ready supply of victims. But Tommy's murders went beyond business necessity. He killed people who didn't need to be killed. He killed associates who posed no real threat. He killed friends over minor slights, most tellingly. He kept trophies from his victims and took visible pleasure in the act of killing and the process of disposing of bodies. Assistant Special Agent Jim Hunt, who led the investigation that eventually brought Tommy down, was clear in his assessment. Tommy was a psychopath, an animal. Hunt had spent years investigating organized crime and had encountered many violent criminals, but Tommy stood out. Hunt described how Tommy would walk into a social club and mobsters, men who had themselves killed people, would instinctively turn to face him. No one wanted their back to Tommy Pitera, Hunt explained. This wasn't respect, this was fear. These hardened criminals recognized something in Tommy that scared them. He was unpredictable, he was dangerous, and he enjoyed hurting people. Tommy's voice added to his unsettling presence. That high-pitched falsetto that had once made him a target for bullying now had a different effect. Hearing that voice issue orders for murder or worse, hearing it while Tommy was in the act of killing someone, created a disturbing cognitive dissonance. It shouldn't be scary voices like that, shouldn't be threatening. But it was, precisely because of the disconnect between sound and action. Agents who interviewed him compared his voice to Richard Widmark's character Tommy Udo in the 1947 film Noir Kiss of Death, where Udo was a psychopathic killer with a distinctive, unsettling voice and laugh. But the agent said Tommy's voice was scarier because it was real. What made Tommy particularly valuable to the Bonanno family, at least initially, was that he could be relied upon for the most difficult work. If someone needed to be killed, Tommy would do it without hesitation. If a body needed to disappear completely, Tommy knew how to make that happen. He showed the family that they could count on him for murder contracts, and perhaps more importantly, for the messy work of body disposal. Many mobsters were willing to pull a trigger, but fewer were willing to deal with what came after: the blood, the body, the evidence. But Tommy didn't just dispose of bodies efficiently, he studied it. His apartment, when it was finally searched by law enforcement, revealed a chilling collection of instructional materials. Investigators found copies of the Hitman's Handbook and Kill or Be Killed, both books that provided detailed instructions on assassination techniques, torture methods, and body disposal. He had books about the dissection of cadavers, medical texts about human anatomy, manuals on torture techniques used by various governments and terrorist organizations. This wasn't casual reading. Tommy was studying death like a scholar, learning the technical details of how to hurt people, how to kill them in various ways, how to cut them up, how to dispose of the evidence. His apartment also contained an arsenal, over 60 automatic weapons, various handguns, knives of all sizes and purposes, and swords, likely a continuation of his martial arts interests from his time in Japan. This was far more weaponry than any one person needed, even a person in Tommy's line of work. It suggested someone who was fascinated by the tools of violence, who collected them, who perhaps fantasized about using them. Most disturbingly, Tommy kept trophies from his victims. When law enforcement finally searched his home after his arrest, they found jewelry belonging to several of his murder victims' rings. Watches, necklaces, trophy-taking is classic serial killer behavior. It allows the killer to relive the murder, to maintain a connection to the victim, to possess something that extends the sense of power and control beyond the moment of death. Professional criminals don't keep trophies. They eliminate evidence. Serial killers keep trophies because the murder itself isn't enough. They need to be able to revisit it, to remember it, to own it in a tangible way. This was the most troubling aspect of Thomas Pitera's psychology. He wasn't just a professional killer operating within the Mafia structure. He was a serial killer who had found the perfect ecosystem to support his pathology. The Mafia gave him victims, protection, and purpose. In return, he gave the family a reliable killer who could handle the jobs others wouldn't touch. It was a symbiotic relationship, at least until Tommy's excesses became so extreme that even the mob recognized he was a liability. The exact number of people Thomas Pitera killed will never be known with certainty. Law enforcement officials have estimated anywhere from 30 to 60 murders over the course of his career. Some were sanctioned by the family legitimate mob business, contracts that needed to be fulfilled. But many, perhaps most, were Tommy's own initiative. People he decided needed to die for reasons that made sense only to his twisted logic. Talal Siksik was one of Tommy's earlier victims. A murder that demonstrated his willingness to kill over relatively minor business disputes. Talal was a Middle Eastern drug supplier, one of the many entrepreneurs who had entered the cocaine trade in the 1980s when demand exploded and traditional mafia control of drug markets was weakening. Talal had done business with Tommy's crew, supplying cocaine and possibly other drugs. But at some point, whether over a debt, a perceived insult, or simply because Tommy decided Talal knew too much about his operations, Tommy decided he had to go. Tommy shot Talal 4 times in the back in his Brooklyn apartment, ambushing him from behind. It was a professional execution, quick, efficient, no struggle. But what Tommy did next revealed his true nature. Rather than simply leaving the body to be discovered or disposing of it in a simple way, Tommy took his time. He dismembered Talal's body, cutting it into 6 pieces with the precision he had learned from his books on cadaver dissection. He wrapped the pieces in plastic, loaded them into his car, and drove to his secret burial ground in Staten Island, where he buried them. This pattern shooting, dismembering, burying would be repeated with many of Tommy's victims. The dismemberment served a practical purpose. It made bodies easier to transport and bury. And by separating body parts, it made identification more difficult if the remains were discovered. But there was also something more going on. Dismemberment requires time, effort, and a strong stomach. Most people, even most criminals, would be repulsed by the process of cutting up a human body. The blood, the smell, the sheer physicality of sawing through bone and tissue. It's deeply disturbing work. But Tommy not only tolerated it, he became expert at it. And according to testimony from associates, he sometimes seemed to enjoy it. Marek Kaczynski died in particularly brutal fashion. Marek was a drug dealer, probably someone who had crossed Tommy in business. During a confrontation, the exact cause is unclear, but likely over money or drugs. Tommy pulled a knife. What followed was a frenzy of violence. Tommy stabbed Marek repeatedly, attacking him with the same focused intensity he had once brought to martial arts training. Witnesses said it was methodical despite the violence. Each stab was deliberate, aimed at specific areas of the body. Finally, Tommy cut Marek's throat, the traditional finishing move used by professional killers to ensure death. Marek's body, like Talal's, was cut into pieces and buried in Staten Island. Joseph Balzano and Andrew Jakulis were 2 more victims added to Tommy's count. Details of their murders are scarce in public records. But both were associated with Tommy's drug operation in some capacity, either as dealers, suppliers, or simply people who knew too much about the crew's activities. Both ended up dead. Both were dismembered. Both were buried in Staten Island. The pattern was becoming clear. If you got involved with Tommy Pitera's operation, if you knew too much, if you crossed him in even a minor way, you might end up in pieces in the ground. But it was the murder of Phyllis Birdie that revealed just how depraved Tommy had become, how far beyond normal mafia violence he had traveled. Phyllis Birdie's murder stands out even among the catalog of horrors Tommy Pitera committed, because she was truly an innocent victim, someone who died for no rational reason, even by the twisted logic of the criminal underworld. Phyllis was the girlfriend of Frank Ganji, one of Tommy's crew members, by all accounts. Phyllis was not involved in the drug business. She wasn't a dealer, wasn't a criminal. She was simply a young woman who had the misfortune of dating a mobster. But Phyllis made a fatal mistake. She was present when Tommy's own girlfriend died of a drug overdose. The circumstances around Tommy's girlfriend's death are not fully clear from public records. But what is known is that she overdosed on drugs, likely cocaine or heroin. Tommy, displaying a characteristic inability to accept responsibility for anything, decided that someone else must be to blame. In his mind, Phyllis must have been responsible in some way. Perhaps she had provided the drugs, or encouraged drug use, or simply failed to prevent the overdose. The exact reasoning didn't matter, because Tommy's reasoning was never rational. He decided Phyllis needed to die, and in Tommy's world, that decision was sufficient. One night, after Phyllis and Frank had spent the evening together using cocaine and probably drinking, the couple returned to their Manhattan apartment. They were both high, probably relaxed, not expecting trouble. But Tommy showed up with an unidentified accomplice. Frank, seeing Tommy and realizing something was very wrong, was powerless to stop what happened next. You don't tell Tommy Pitera no. You don't defend someone from him. If you try, you end up dead too. Tommy and his accomplice took Phyllis into the bathroom. She was passed out from drugs and alcohol, unconscious and helpless. Tommy shot her while she lay there, unable to defend herself, unable even to be aware of what was happening. Then, while Frank waited in the next room, paralyzed by fear and cocaine and the realization that his girlfriend was being murdered by his associate, Tommy dismembered Phyllis's body right there in the bathroom of the Manhattan apartment, with his girlfriend's boyfriend in the next room. Tommy cut Phyllis Birdie into 6 pieces. Frank Ganji would later testify about this murder, and his testimony painted a picture of pure horror. He described hearing the sounds from the bathroom, sounds that anyone who heard would never forget. He described Tommy emerging periodically to get different tools, going about the dismemberment with workmanlike efficiency. And he described his own paralysis, his inability to do anything, his knowledge that if he tried to interfere or showed too much emotion, he would be next. This murder crossed a line that even hardened mobsters recognized. Killing other criminals, even violently, was understandable within the twisted morality of the Mafia. Killing witnesses or informants, while distasteful, was sometimes necessary. But killing your crew member's girlfriend, someone who posed no real threat, someone who was unconscious and helpless, and doing it in front of her boyfriend, that was something else. That was psychopathic behavior, the action of someone who killed not because he had to, but because he wanted to, because he enjoyed the power and control. And then there was the bath story, according to Frank Ganji's testimony, which was never refuted and which prosecutors found credible enough to use in their case against Tommy. There was one incident that epitomized Tommy's depravity. He once took a bath with a corpse. The victim was an alleged informant, someone Tommy believed was cooperating with law enforcement. Such suspicions, whether true or not, were a death sentence in the mob world. But what Tommy did went far beyond the standard mob execution. He didn't just shoot the informant and dispose of the body. Instead, he brought the body to his apartment, ran a bath, and got into the tub with the corpse there. Sitting naked in the water with a dead man, Tommy dismembered the body. The image is almost incomprehensible in its horror. Dismembering a body is terrible enough, requiring a complete suppression of normal human empathy and disgust, but choosing to do it in a bath, sitting in water that would soon be filled with blood and other bodily fluids, suggests something beyond even typical psychopathic behavior. It suggests someone who not only lacked empathy, but who actively enjoyed the intimacy of death, who wanted to immerse himself literally in the act of destruction. When Frank Ganji later told investigators about the bath incident, even these hardened law enforcement officials, men who had seen countless crime scenes, who had investigated murders, rapes, tortures, were shocked. This crossed a boundary that exists even in the violent world of organized crime. Mobsters kill, but they don't typically revel in it. They don't create unnecessary intimacy with death. The bath story became a crucial piece of testimony because it demonstrated that Tommy Pitera wasn't just a professional killer doing a job. He was something much darker, something that made him dangerous even to the people he worked with. It was around this time that some of Tommy's associates began to realize that they weren't working with a normal mob killer. They were working with a serial killer who happened to be in the Mafia. But Tommy's most distinctive signature wasn't the bath or even the dismemberments themselves, it was his graveyard. In Staten Island, near the William T. Davis Wildlife Refuge, Tommy had found the perfect burial ground. The refuge is a nature preserve covering hundreds of acres. Designated to protect woodland and wetland habitats, it's a beautiful, peaceful place, exactly the kind of location where you wouldn't expect to find a mob graveyard. But Tommy had chosen it carefully, and his choice revealed his methodical nature. The location had several advantages. First, it was relatively isolated. People visited the refuge, but mostly during daylight hours and on designated trails. The areas where Tommy buried bodies were off the paths, deep enough in the woods that casual visitors wouldn't stumble upon them. Second, the soil was damp, which would accelerate decomposition. Bodies buried in dry soil can take years to fully decompose, potentially allowing for identification even long after death. But in moist soil, with the assistance of bacteria and insects that thrive in wetland environments, decomposition happens much faster. Third, as a wildlife refuge, the area was protected from development. There would be no construction projects digging up the ground, no new roads or buildings that might accidentally uncover the graves. But Tommy's methodology went beyond just choosing a good location. He had developed a specific procedure for burial that demonstrated careful planning. First, he would decapitate his victims. The head would be cut off cleanly. Tommy had the right tools and the knowledge to do this efficiently. Then he would bury the heads separately from the bodies, often some distance away. The purpose was strategic. If the bodies were ever discovered, identification would be much more difficult without the heads. In the 1980s, before DNA testing was commonplace, bodies were typically identified through facial features, fingerprints or dental records, by burying heads separately. Tommy eliminated 2 of those 3 identification methods. Even if investigators found the bodies, they couldn't use dental records to identify them without the heads. Tommy buried 6 of his victims in the Staten Island location. 6 people who had been alive, who had families, who had lives and dreams and futures, all cut short by Tommy's bullets, and then literally cut into pieces by his saws and knives. Their bodies lay in those damp woods for years, slowly decomposing while Tommy continued to live his life, continued to kill, continued to run his drug operation. It's worth pausing to consider what this graveyard represents. Each body buried there represented hours of work for Tommy, the killing itself, the dismemberment, the transportation of body parts, the digging of graves, the burial, the concealment. This wasn't work that Tommy had to do. The Mafia has many ways to dispose of bodies. You can drop them in the ocean, weighted down with chains. You can dissolve them in acid. You can burn them. You can bury them in fresh concrete at a construction site. Many mobsters simply left bodies where they fell, figuring that was the police's problem to deal with. But Tommy chose this elaborate method. He chose to spend hours cutting up each body. He chose to drive to Staten Island with car trunks and back seats full of body parts. He chose to dig multiple graves for each victim. He chose all of this because some part of him enjoyed the process, the control, the intimacy with death. This was the behavior of a serial killer, not a professional criminal. The Bonanno family leadership, to the extent they knew the details of Tommy's methods, probably didn't care much. They cared that he was reliable, that he was earning, that he was handling problems without creating bigger problems. If his methods were excessive, well, better too thorough than careless. But they didn't realize or chose not to realize that Tommy's behavior was becoming increasingly erratic and dangerous. Even to them, August 29, 1988, was a hot summer day in Brooklyn, the kind of oppressive heat that makes the city feel airless and trapped. Wilfred "Willie Boy" Johnson, a longtime associate of Gambino family boss John Gotti, walked out of his Brooklyn home that morning. Heading to his car parked on the street, Willie Boy was 52 years old, had been involved with the Gambino family since the 1960s, and had been particularly close to John Gotti for decades. They had started out together as petty thieves and burglars, had done time together, had risen through the ranks together. Willie Boy had been Gotti's trusted driver, his reliable associate, a constant presence in Gotti's inner circle. But Willie Boy had a secret. Since 1966, he had been providing information to the FBI for 22 years. Willie Boy Johnson had been a confidential informant, feeding details about Gambino family operations to federal agents. He hadn't testified in court, hadn't worn a wire. He had simply provided information during private meetings with his handlers. The FBI had kept his cooperation secret, promising him protection, promising his identity would never be revealed. But in 1985, defense attorneys for several Gambino family members being prosecuted in a racketeering case got access to FBI files and discovered Willie Boy's cooperation. The secret was out. John Gotti, the man Willie Boy had considered a friend for nearly 30 years, learned that his trusted driver had been an informant for over 2 decades. Every conversation they'd had, every piece of business Willie Boy had been privy to, every secret he'd learned, all of it had potentially been shared with the FBI. In the Mafia, being an informant is the ultimate betrayal, punishable by death, the code of omerta. The vow of silence that every made member takes extends to associates as well. You don't cooperate with law enforcement under any circumstances. You take your chances in court. You do your time in prison if necessary. But you never, ever talk to the FBI. Willie Boy had violated this fundamental rule, and he had done it for 22 years. Gotti wanted him dead, but there was a complication. Willie Boy Johnson wasn't a made member of the Gambino family because he was part Native American, and the Mafia's rules required that made members be 100% Italian because he wasn't made. Technically, anyone could kill him without seeking permission from the Gambino leadership. But Willie Boy had been so close to Gotti that killing him without Gotti's knowledge would have been seen as disrespectful. And Gotti himself couldn't be too directly involved in the murder, because the FBI would immediately suspect him and the investigation would be intense. The solution was to farm out the contract to someone from another family, someone who could handle the job professionally and who wouldn't be immediately connected to Gotti. The contract was given to Tommy Pitera and his partner, Vincent Kojak Getino, of the Bonanno family. For Tommy, this was an opportunity. Killing Willie Boy Johnson would be a high-profile hit, the kind of job that elevated your status in the Mafia hierarchy. This wasn't some low-level drug dealer or unknown associate. This was a man who had been close to one of the most powerful bosses in New York. A hit that would be noticed throughout the 5 families. If Tommy and Kojak handled it professionally, their reputations would be enhanced. They would be seen as reliable, capable of handling sensitive contracts. On that August morning, Tommy and Kojak were waiting as Willie Boy walked toward his car. The hit was textbook professional. They ambushed him in broad daylight on the street, firing multiple shots. Willie Boy Johnson died there on the Brooklyn sidewalk, killed by men he had never met. Ordered by a man he had once considered a friend, the murder made headlines. Willie Boy Johnson's long cooperation with the FBI became public knowledge. The story had everything the media loved: betrayal, friendship turned deadly, the secret life of an informant, connections to John Gotti, who was already becoming a media celebrity. The FBI, embarrassed that their informant had been killed despite their promises of protection, launched an intense investigation. Tommy and Kojak were eventually charged with Willie Boy's murder. Prosecutors believed they had solid evidence connecting the 2 Bonanno soldiers to the hit. But at trial, the evidence wasn't strong enough. The witnesses were unreliable, the physical evidence was circumstantial, and the prosecution couldn't prove beyond a reasonable doubt that Tommy and Kojak had pulled the triggers. Both men were acquitted of the Willie Boy Johnson murder. It was a victory for Tommy, but it was also the peak of his criminal career. The acquittal allowed him to avoid prison on that charge, but it also brought unwanted attention. Law enforcement now knew who Tommy Pitera was. They knew he was a killer. They began investigating him more intensively, looking into his drug operation, his other murders, his methods. The Willie Boy Johnson hit elevated Tommy's reputation, but it had also painted a target on his back, and federal investigators were beginning to receive information from someone inside Tommy's own crew, someone who had witnessed Tommy's worst atrocities and couldn't live with the memories anymore. April 1990, Frank Ganji Jr. was arrested for driving under the influence, a mundane charge. The kind of thing that happens to thousands of people every year. He was processed and put in a holding cell to sober up before being released or arraigned. It was routine, nothing special, just another DUI in New York City. But as Frank sat in that cell, something broke inside him. He thought about Phyllis Birdie, his girlfriend, murdered by Tommy while she lay unconscious. Her body cut into pieces in their bathroom while Frank listened from the next room, too afraid to stop it. He thought about the other murders he had witnessed or participated in, the blood, the screams, the matter-of-fact way Tommy killed people over minor slights or perceived threats. He thought about the bath story Tommy had told him, bragging about dismembering a body while sitting in the tub with it. He thought about the drugs, the constant paranoia, the knowledge that he was one mistake away from being Tommy's next victim. Frank had been raised in the life. His uncle, Rosario Ganji, was a respected captain in the Genovese crime family. Frank understood the code of omerta. He knew that cooperating with law enforcement was the ultimate betrayal, that informants were despised, that the punishment for talking was death. But he also knew something else. Tommy Pitera was going to keep killing, and Frank might be next. The murders were escalating. Tommy's behavior was becoming more erratic, and Frank Ganji had witnessed too much. He knew where the bodies were buried, literally. He knew details about murders, drug operations, the whole criminal enterprise. In Tommy's paranoid mind, that made Frank a liability. So Frank made a decision that would change everything. He requested to speak to a detective. When the detective arrived, expecting to discuss the DUI charge, Frank Ganji instead began to confess. He confessed to being a member of Tommy Pitera's drug-dealing crew. He confessed to participating in 5 murders. He provided information about many other murders committed by Tommy. He told them about the drug operation. about the 50 kilograms of cocaine they had sold between 1987 and 1989. He told them about the dismemberments, the bodies buried in Staten Island, and most importantly, he told them where to find the victims. The detective listening to this confession must have initially been skeptical. Criminals looking to reduce charges sometimes make up stories or exaggerate their knowledge, but as Frank continued talking, providing specific details, names, dates, locations, it became clear this was the real thing. This was someone from inside a major criminal operation who was willing to testify about multiple murders. Frank's cooperation was especially significant because of who he was. This wasn't some low-level associate with limited knowledge. Frank was the nephew of a Genovese captain. He was educated, articulate, credible, and he was willing to testify in court. To face Tommy Pitera in a courtroom and tell a jury about the murders he had witnessed and participated in. The NYPD immediately contacted the D because Tommy's operation involved large-scale drug trafficking, which was federal jurisdiction. The D, already aware of Tommy through various investigations, immediately recognized the value of Frank's cooperation. This was the break they needed to take down one of the most violent drug crews in New York. But first, they needed to verify Frank's information. They needed to find the bodies. D Assistant Special Agent Jim Hunt had been tracking Tommy Pitera for 3 years. Hunt was an experienced investigator who had worked numerous organized crime cases. But Tommy's operation had been frustratingly difficult to crack. Tommy was careful, disciplined, and ruthlessly efficient at eliminating anyone who might cooperate with law enforcement. Witnesses disappeared. Associates turned up dead. The few people who knew details about Tommy's operations were too terrified to talk. But Frank Ganji's cooperation changed everything for the first time. Investigators had someone on the inside who could provide detailed, specific information about Tommy's drug operations and his murders. Hunt and his team went to work building a case. They used wiretaps, obtaining court authorization to monitor Tommy's phone conversations. What they captured was chilling. Tommy discussed methods for dismembering and disposing of bodies with the casual tone most people used to discuss home repair projects. He talked about where to cut, how to separate heads from bodies, the best tools for sawing through bone. The recordings provided direct evidence not just of Tommy's knowledge of these techniques, but of his hands-on involvement in multiple murders. Surveillance teams followed Tommy and his associates, documenting meetings, tracking movements, photographing associates. They identified the full scope of Tommy's crew and began developing evidence against each member. They interviewed other witnesses, people who had done business with Tommy, people who had heard rumors, people who were terrified but willing to talk once they learned that Tommy was the target of a major federal investigation. Each interview added pieces to the puzzle, but the crucial corroboration of Frank Ganji's testimony came from Staten Island. Based on Frank's detailed information about the location of Tommy's burial ground, investigators went to the William T. Davis Wildlife Refuge. Frank had provided precise descriptions, how far from particular landmarks, what the terrain looked like, approximately where each victim was buried. The search teams brought cadaver dogs, ground-penetrating radar, and archaeological experts. And they found them, 6 of Tommy's victims, exactly where Frank said they would be. The bodies, or what remained of them, were carefully exhumed. Each one had been dismembered. Each one was missing its head, which was eventually found buried separately. Just as Frank had described, the level of decomposition varied. But forensic experts could still determine cause of death in most cases: gunshot wounds, knife wounds, the systematic nature of the burials, the separate burial of heads, the methodical approach, all of it matched Frank's testimony. The discovery of the Staten Island graveyard was front-page news. The media dubbed it a mob graveyard, and the details, the dismemberment, the separate burial of heads, horrified the public. This wasn't the romantic vision of the Mafia presented in movies. This was the reality. Brutal, methodical, inhuman, with the bodies discovered, wiretaps providing direct evidence, and Frank Gangi ready to testify. Hunt and his team had built an overwhelming case. On June 4, 1990, a federal grand jury indicted Thomas Pitera. The charges were extensive: leading a criminal enterprise, the Continuing Criminal Enterprise Statute, often called the Drug Kingpin Law; conspiracy to distribute cocaine, heroin, and marijuana; 7 counts of murder, including the Willie Boy Johnson hit; illegal possession of firearms, if convicted on all counts. Tommy faced the death penalty. The federal death penalty statute had been reinstated in 1988, and prosecutors were eager to use it against someone like Tommy, whose crimes seemed tailor-made for the ultimate punishment on the day of his arrest. FBI agents descended on Tommy's Gravesend apartment with a search warrant. What they found confirmed everything Frank Gangi had told them, and more. The apartment was an armory, over 60 automatic weapons, rifles, shotguns, and handguns. There were knives of every description: hunting knives, military knives, custom-made knives with specialized blades. There were swords, likely remnants from Tommy's martial arts training in Japan. But more disturbing than the weapons were the books. Investigators found the Hitman's Handbook and Kill or Be Killed, instructional manuals that provided detailed information on assassination techniques. They found books about torture methods used by various intelligence agencies and terrorist organizations. Most chillingly, they found medical texts dealing with human anatomy and books specifically about the dissection of cadavers. This wasn't casual reading. This was a library curated by someone with a deep academic interest in death and dismemberment. And they found the trophies, jewelry belonging to several of Tommy's murder victims, wedding rings, watches, bracelets, items that had been on the victims' bodies when they died, taken by Tommy and kept as souvenirs. This was perhaps the most damning evidence of Tommy's psychology. A professional criminal would never keep such evidence. It was forensically dangerous, providing direct physical links between Tommy and his victims. But serial killers keep trophies because the psychological gratification outweighs the risk. The trophies allow them to relive the murders, to maintain a connection to their victims, to possess something tangible from their acts of violence. Tommy Pitera was arrested, processed, and held without bail. He was facing potentially the most significant Mafia murder trial in years, and the evidence against him seemed overwhelming. The trial of Thomas Pitera began in the spring of 1992 in federal court in Brooklyn. The presiding judge was Rina Raji, a sharp, no-nonsense jurist who had handled numerous organized crime cases. The prosecution was led by Assistant U.S. Attorney David W. Shapiro, an experienced prosecutor with a track record of successful Mafia convictions. Shapiro made clear from the beginning that he would seek the death penalty, arguing that Tommy's crimes were heinous, cruel, and depraved, and that he was a heartless and ruthless killer who deserved the ultimate punishment. Tommy's defense team consisted of 3 capable attorneys: Matthew J. Mari, David A. Runk, and Cheryl Hammer Mell. They faced a nearly impossible task. The evidence against Tommy was overwhelming, but they did their best to create reasonable doubt, arguing that the prosecution's witnesses, particularly Frank Gangi, were scurrilous scoundrels who were lying to reduce their own sentences, that they were blaming Tommy for crimes they had committed themselves. The trial lasted several weeks and featured testimony from 66 witnesses. It was a comprehensive prosecution, leaving no aspect of Tommy's criminal career unexamined. The trial began with law enforcement witnesses, the agents, FBI agents, NYPD detectives who established the scope of the investigation, the wiretap evidence, the discovery of the bodies in Staten Island. Forensic experts testified about the victims' remains, how they had been dismembered, how long they had been buried, cause of death, These technical witnesses established the facts: 6 bodies, all dismembered, all buried in the pattern Frank Gangi had described. But the trial's pivotal testimony came from Frank Gangi himself. Frank took the stand and spent days testifying about Tommy's operations and murders. He described the drug business in detail, the sources of supply, the distribution network, the amounts of drugs moved, the money generated. He testified about participating in 5 murders and witnessing or having knowledge of many others. He described Tommy's methods, the careful planning, the cold-blooded executions, the systematic dismemberment of bodies. And he testified about the murder of his girlfriend, Phyllis Bordy. The courtroom was silent as Frank described that night, how Tommy and an accomplice had shown up at the apartment, how they had taken Phyllis into the bathroom, the sound of the gunshot, and then the sounds of dismemberment. He described his own paralysis, his inability to help her, his knowledge that objecting would mean his own death. His testimony was emotional but credible. This wasn't the testimony of someone making up stories to reduce his sentence. This was the testimony of someone who had witnessed something that would haunt him forever. Frank also testified about the bath story: Tommy's dismemberment of a corpse in a bathtub. The jury's reaction was visible: shock, revulsion, disbelief that any human being could do such a thing. Even in a trial about murder, this detail stood out for its sheer depravity. Other witnesses corroborated Frank's testimony. Associates testified about Tommy's violence, his reputation, his willingness to kill over minor provocations. Neighbors testified about seeing Tommy and his associates carrying heavy bags and plastic-wrapped bundles to cars late at night. Drug dealers who had managed to avoid becoming Tommy's victims testified about his operation and his brutal enforcement methods. The physical evidence was displayed for the jury: the weapons, the books about killing and dissection, the jewelry taken from victims, photographs of the murder victims. Both before and after death were shown. Crime scene photos from the Staten Island graveyard showed the careful, methodical burial of dismembered bodies. Wiretap recordings were played, allowing the jury to hear Tommy's voice discussing murder and body disposal. Throughout the trial, Tommy showed little emotion. He sat at the defense table, occasionally conferring with his attorneys, but mostly observing with detached interest, as if the trial were about someone else. That distinctive high-pitched voice was heard when he occasionally made comments to his lawyers, creating the now familiar cognitive dissonance between sound and the brutal acts being described. The defense did their best. They attacked Frank Gangi's credibility, highlighting his own admitted participation in murders, arguing that he was fabricating or exaggerating Tommy's role to make himself look less guilty. They suggested that the jewelry found in Tommy's apartment could have been planted. They questioned the reliability of wiretap recordings, suggesting statements were taken out of context. They presented character witnesses who testified that Tommy was quiet, disciplined, respectful, nothing like the monster the prosecution was describing. But the evidence was overwhelming. The bodies had been found exactly where Frank said they would be. The dismemberment matched Frank's descriptions. The wiretaps confirmed Tommy's knowledge and involvement. The trophies connected him directly to victims. And witness after witness testified to Tommy's violence and his reputation as a killer. As the trial moved toward closing arguments, the only real question wasn't whether Tommy would be convicted, but whether he would get the death penalty. The prosecution's closing argument was powerful and emotional. David Shapiro walked the jury through the evidence, building a comprehensive picture of Tommy Pitera as a serial killer who had operated under the protection of the Mafia. He emphasized the brutality of the murders, the systematic dismemberment, the trophies, the bath story. He reminded the jury that Tommy had shown no remorse, no recognition that his victims were human beings with families, with lives that had value. Shapiro argued for the death penalty, stating that Tommy's crimes met all the criteria for the ultimate punishment. The murders were premeditated, They were committed in a particularly cruel manner. They were done for financial gain, and they demonstrated a complete disregard for human life. Mr. Pitera is not just a killer, Shapiro told the jury. He is a predator who enjoyed what he did, who studied it, who perfected it. The death penalty exists for people exactly like him. The defense's closing argument acknowledged the difficulty of their position, but emphasized reasonable doubt and urged the jury not to base their verdict on emotion. Mari, Runk, and Mel argued that Frank Ganji was an unreliable witness with every reason to lie, that much of the evidence was circumstantial, and that executing Tommy based on the testimony of admitted killers seeking leniency would be a miscarriage of justice. The jury deliberated for several days. During deliberations, they requested to review certain evidence, to hear portions of testimony read back, particularly Frank Ganji's testimony about the murders. The length of deliberation suggested they were taking the responsibilities seriously, carefully weighing the evidence and the appropriate punishment. Verdict and sentencing on June 25, 1992. The jury returned with their verdict. On the charge of leading a continuing criminal enterprise, guilty. On the charge of conspiracy to distribute narcotics, guilty. On the murder charges, the jury convicted Tommy of murdering 6 people: Talal Siksik, Phyllis Birdie, Marek Kaczynski, Joseph Balzano, Andrew Jakulis, and one other victim whose identity had been confirmed through the investigation. Significantly, Tommy was acquitted of the Willie Boy Johnson murder. Despite prosecutors' certainty that Tommy and Kojak had committed that hit, the jury found the evidence insufficient to prove guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. It was a small victory for Tommy, but a meaningful one. The Willie Boy hit had been the most high-profile charge, and the acquittal suggested the jury was carefully evaluating each charge rather than simply convicting on everything. But the jury rejected the death penalty after careful deliberation. They decided that while Tommy deserved to spend the rest of his life in prison, execution was not warranted. The reasons for this decision were not made public. Jury deliberations are confidential, but legal observers suggested several possibilities. Some jurors may have had moral objections to the death penalty. Some may have felt that life in prison was sufficient punishment. Or some may have been swayed by the defense's argument that Tommy's violent upbringing and the influence of the Mafia were mitigating factors. Tommy's reaction to the verdict was telling. When not guilty was read for the death penalty, Tommy smiled. He turned to reporters in the Brooklyn courtroom and gave them a thumbs up. In his twisted perception, this was a victory. He had avoided execution. He would spend the rest of his life in prison, yes, but he would live. In the high-stakes game of mob prosecutions, where many defendants faced death or life sentences, avoiding the death penalty counted as winning. Formal sentencing took place in October 1992. Judge Rina Raji, who had presided over the trial with firm control and evident disgust at the details that had emerged, delivered a powerful sentencing statement. The prosecution has produced overwhelming evidence of Mr. Pitera's guilt, Judge Raji stated. The systematic nature of these murders, the deliberate dismemberment of bodies, the complete absence of remorse, all of this paints a picture of someone who is profoundly dangerous and who can never be safely released into society. Then she turned to address Tommy directly. Mr. Pitera, nobody deserves to die as these people died. The manner in which you killed your victims, the cold calculation with which you disposed of their bodies, the trophies you kept, all of this demonstrates a complete absence of human empathy. You are a danger to everyone around you, and you will remain so for the rest of your life. Judge Raji sentenced Tommy to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Under federal law, this meant exactly what it said. Tommy would never be released. He would die in prison. There would be no parole hearings, no opportunities for early release, no chance of clemency. He would spend the next 30, 40, perhaps 50 years behind bars. growing old in a federal penitentiary, until eventually dying of natural causes or prison violence. Tommy showed no emotion during sentencing, if Judge Raji's words affected him. He gave no indication. He simply stood, accepted the sentence, and was led out of the courtroom in shackles. Vincent Kojak Jadino, Tommy's partner in many of the murders, was tried separately and also convicted. He received a life sentence as well, ensuring that both men would die in prison. But the most controversial aspect of the case was Frank Ganji's sentence. Frank Ganji had admitted to participating in 5 murders under normal circumstances. Such crimes would warrant a life sentence or even the death penalty, but Frank had cooperated. He had provided information that led to the discovery of 6 bodies, the conviction of Tommy Pitera and Vincent Jateno, and the dismantling of a major drug operation in the federal system. Such cooperation is rewarded, sometimes dramatically, Judge Raji, the same judge who had given Tommy life without parole, sentenced Frank Ganji to just 10 years in prison. The disparity was stark and intentional. Judge Raji explained her reasoning. "I view your cooperation as extraordinary, more than any other person who's ever appeared before me. You provided information at great personal risk. You testified truthfully and comprehensively. Without your cooperation, Mr. Pitera would likely still be operating freely, killing people. Your testimony has saved lives." Frank ended up serving less than 9 years total. Considering time served and good behavior, he was released from federal prison in the late 1990s, entered the Witness Protection Program, and began a new life under a new identity. The government helped him relocate far from New York, provided him with a new social security number, and gave him a stipend to help him start over from prison. Tommy was enraged by Frank's light sentence. In letters and in conversations with other inmates, Tommy railed against what he saw as injustice. "Ganji is a liar and a coward," Tommy wrote in one letter that eventually made its way into the media. "But beyond that, he's a wimp and a crybaby. If you're really sorry for killing 5 people, you take your punishment like a man." He got what I call a laminated get-out-of-jail-free card by ratting. The irony was extraordinary. Tommy, who had killed as many as 60 people, who had shown zero remorse for any of his victims, who had kept trophies and taken baths with corpses, was complaining about the injustice of his accomplice getting a lighter sentence. Tommy's complete lack of self-awareness, his inability to recognize the monstrosity of his own actions while condemning others for lesser crimes, was characteristic of his psychopathy. But Tommy's complaints didn't matter. He was in federal prison serving life without parole, and no amount of complaining would change that. Frank Ganji died in 2022, having lived for decades under his new identity. The man who had brought down Tommy Pitera, who had witnessed some of the most horrific murders in Mafia history, took his memories to the grave, but his testimony had ensured that justice was served, that a serial killer was removed from society, and that at least 6 families got some measure of closure about what had happened to their loved ones. Thomas Pitera was initially housed at USP McCreary, a high-security federal penitentiary in Pine Knot, Kentucky. Later, he was transferred to USP Big Sandy in Inez, Kentucky, where he remains as of recent reports. Life in federal prison is regimented and harsh, particularly in high-security institutions like Big Sandy. Inmates are confined to their cells for much of the day, with limited time in the yard or common areas. Contact with the outside world is restricted to letters, approved phone calls, and occasional visits from family members who go through extensive security screening. For someone like Tommy, serving life without parole, there is no light at the end of the tunnel. No date to count down to, no hope of release. Every day is the same, and every day will continue to be the same until death. But Tommy adapted. Inmates serving life sentences have to adapt the alternative as madness or suicide. Some find religion, some become jailhouse lawyers, filing endless appeals and motions. Some retreat into themselves, becoming shells of who they once were. Tommy found art over the years in prison. Tommy took up drawing. He developed a distinctive style and began creating artwork regularly. His subjects varied, sometimes landscapes, sometimes portraits, sometimes more abstract pieces. The artwork was competent, showing genuine talent and dedication to craft. For someone who had spent so much of his life focused on destruction, the shift to creation was notable. Though whether it represented genuine redemption or simply a way to pass time is unknowable. In a remarkable development that would have seemed impossible in earlier decades, Tommy's artwork found its way online. He established a presence on social media, specifically Instagram, where his drawings are posted, presumably by a family member or friend acting on his behalf. He also sells his artwork through a website, with prices ranging from modest to substantial depending on the piece. The prison allows such activities as long as they follow regulations and don't involve criminal conduct. The fact that a convicted serial killer was selling artwork on Instagram struck many as disturbing. Some people argued it was inappropriate, that Tommy was profiting from his notoriety, that he should have no platform to present himself to the public. Others countered that he was creating legitimate art, that keeping inmates engaged in productive activities reduces violence and recidivism, though recidivism obviously isn't a concern for someone serving life without parole, and that the artwork was separate from his crimes. Tommy has remained largely silent about his crimes. He has given no interviews to journalists. He has written no tell-all memoir. Unlike many high-profile mobsters who eventually cooperate with authorities or write books, Tommy has stayed true to the code of omerta. He has not testified against other Bonanno family members. He has not provided information about unsolved murders in the strange honor system of the Mafia. This loyalty is respected, even for someone who is widely considered to have been a psychopath. Despite the overwhelming evidence against him, Tommy continued to fight his conviction through the appeals process. This is standard for inmates serving life sentences. There's nothing to lose by appealing. And occasionally appeals succeed in overturning convictions or reducing sentences. In April 2010, Tommy filed a motion for DNA testing. He argued that certain items that had been in Frank Ganji's possession should be tested for DNA evidence. Tommy's argument was that if DNA from the victims was found on these items, but not on items connected to Tommy, it would prove that Frank was more directly involved in the murders than he had admitted, which would undermine Frank's credibility as a witness, which might be grounds for overturning Tommy's conviction. It was a creative legal argument, the kind that occasionally succeeds in creating reasonable doubt years after conviction. Advances in DNA testing had led to numerous exonerations of wrongly convicted people, and defense attorneys had become adept at using new forensic techniques to challenge old convictions. But on April 3, 2012, the U.S. Second Circuit Court of Appeals denied Tommy's motion. The court's reasoning was straightforward. Even if DNA evidence showed that Frank Ganji had been more directly involved in the murders than he admitted, it wouldn't exonerate Tommy. The evidence against Tommy was overwhelming and came from multiple sources. The wiretap showed Tommy discussing murders and body disposal. The bodies were found exactly where investigators had been told they would be. The jewelry from victims was found in Tommy's home. Multiple witnesses beyond Frank had testified about Tommy's involvement in various crimes. The court's opinion essentially said Frank Ganji's testimony was important, but it was far from the only evidence against you. Even if we completely disregard his testimony, the remaining evidence is more than sufficient to support your conviction. It was a decisive rejection of Tommy's appeal, and it foreclosed one of his most promising avenues for overturning his conviction. The courts were not going to reverse this conviction based on technicalities or new DNA evidence. Tommy Pitera was going to remain in prison for the rest of his life. To understand Thomas Pitera, we must ask a question that has troubled psychologists, criminologists, and law enforcement officials for decades. What creates a person like this? What transforms a bullied kid from Brooklyn into one of the most brutal serial killers in American Mafia history? The story begins with trauma. Young Tommy was relentlessly bullied for his high-pitched voice, subjected to daily humiliation, physical abuse, and social rejection during the crucial years when identity and self-worth are being formed. Psychologists who have studied Tommy's case note that this kind of prolonged childhood trauma can have profound effects on psychological development. The constant assault on his manhood, the attacks on his basic sense of self, the daily reminder that he was different and therefore vulnerable, all of this likely created deep psychological wounds. But trauma alone doesn't create serial killers. Millions of people are bullied as children. Most don't become murderers. What made Tommy different? One factor was his response to the trauma. Rather than internalizing the pain as depression or self-harm, Tommy externalized it as rage. He transformed his victimhood into a burning desire for power and control. The martial arts training gave him the tools to act on that rage, providing both physical capability and a philosophical framework that normalized violence. His time in Japan was particularly formative. He spent over 2 years immersed in warrior culture, studying not just fighting techniques but the philosophy of the samurai. He learned about honor through strength, about facing death without fear, about the warrior as an ideal. But Tommy absorbed these teachings through his own damaged psychology. Where a healthy person might learn discipline and self-control, Tommy learned that violence was a legitimate tool for achieving respect. That strength was the ultimate virtue, that killing could be honorable. When he returned to Brooklyn and became involved with the Mafia, Tommy found the perfect ecosystem for his pathology. The mob gave him victims, protection, and purpose in legitimate society. Tommy's inclinations toward violence would have made him a criminal and eventually landed him in prison. But in the Mafia, those same inclinations made him valuable. He was given opportunities to kill, rewards for killing, and protection from prosecution for killing. For a budding psychopath, it was ideal. But Tommy went beyond even what the Mafia required. This is the crucial distinction between Tommy and typical mob killers. Most Mafia hitmen view murder as work unpleasant perhaps, but necessary for success in their chosen profession. They kill because the boss orders it, because someone is interfering with business, because the code demands it. They don't enjoy the killing itself. They enjoy the rewards that come from being known as reliable killers. Tommy was different. Tommy studied death like a scholar. He read books about torture and dismemberment. He kept trophies from his victims. He developed elaborate disposal methods that went far beyond what was necessary. The bath story, sitting in a tub with a corpse while dismembering it, crossed every line of even mob brutality. This wasn't professional, this was personal. This was someone who derived satisfaction from the act of killing and the intimacy with death. Dr. Robert Hare, one of the world's leading experts on psychopathy and creator of the psychopathy checklist, has noted that psychopaths are characterized by several key traits: lack of empathy, inability to feel remorse, shallow emotions, manipulativeness, and what he calls instrumental aggression, violence used as a tool to achieve goals rather than as an emotional response. Tommy exhibited all of these traits, but Tommy also exhibited traits associated with sadism, deriving pleasure from causing pain and suffering. The combination of psychopathy and sadism is particularly dangerous. Psychopaths can be successful in legitimate professions. They become CEOs, politicians, surgeons. Their lack of empathy and emotional detachment can even be advantageous in certain contexts. But when psychopathy is combined with sadism and given an outlet for violence, you get serial killers. This is what Tommy Pitera was, a psychopathic sadist who found the perfect cover in the Mafia. He was a serial killer with a badge, so to speak, operating under the protection of organized crime. The mob gave him victims and immunity from prosecution. In return, he gave the family a reliable killer who would handle the jobs others wouldn't touch. Several of Tommy's behaviors are textbook serial killer characteristics. Trophy taking. Keeping jewelry from victims allowed Tommy to relive the murders, to maintain a connection to his victims, to possess tangible evidence of his power over them. Escalation. Tommy's murders became more elaborate over time. He didn't just shoot people and leave them, he dismembered them, buried them in elaborate ways, developed systems and methods. Ritual. The systematic dismemberment, the separation of heads from bodies, the careful burial. These suggest ritualistic behavior, actions that held psychological significance beyond practical necessity. Lack of remorse. Tommy never expressed regret for any of his murders. Even when caught, even when facing the death penalty, he showed no recognition that his victims were human beings who mattered. Narcissism. Tommy's anger at Frank Ganji, getting a lighter sentence while showing no awareness of his own far greater crimes, demonstrates classic narcissistic thinking. Unable to see beyond his own perspective. Forensic psychologist Dr. Michael Stone, creator of the gradations of evil scale that ranks murderers and serial killers by the severity of their crimes, would likely place Tommy near the top of his scale, on Stone's scale. The highest levels are reserved for psychopathic sadists who torture and kill for prolonged periods. People like Dennis Rader, the BTK killer, Ted Bundy in his later killings, and Jeffrey Dahmer. Tommy Pitera belongs in this category. The question remains, was Tommy born this way, or did his experiences create him? The answer is probably both. Modern psychology recognizes that psychopathy has both genetic and environmental components. Some people are born with neurological differences that predispose them to psychopathic traits, reduced activity in brain regions associated with empathy and emotional processing. But whether these traits become criminal depends largely on environment. Tommy may have been born with a predisposition toward psychopathy, but the bullying, the humiliation, the martial arts training that taught him violence could be a solution. The immersion in warrior culture that normalized killing, the entry into the Mafia that gave him opportunities and protection, all of these environmental factors shaped what Tommy became. If Tommy had been born into a different family, in a different neighborhood, without the bullying, without the connection to organized crime, would he still have become a killer? Possibly. Some psychopaths become criminals regardless of circumstances. But he might also have channeled his traits into less destructive outlets. Not all psychopaths become killers. Many lead superficially normal lives, using their traits to succeed in business or other competitive fields. But Tommy was born into circumstances that activated and cultivated the worst aspects of his psychology, transforming a damaged boy into a monster. Amid all the analysis of Tommy's psychology and methods, it's crucial to remember the victims, the real people whose lives he destroyed, the families left without closure. The human cost of his pathology. Tylo Siksik was a businessman, a drug supplier trying to make money in a dangerous trade. He had a family, had people who cared about him. His death was brutal, and his body dismembered and buried like garbage. Phyllis Birdie was perhaps the most innocent victim. She wasn't involved in crime, she was simply dating a mobster and was present when Tommy's girlfriend overdosed. For this, she was murdered while unconscious, her body cut into pieces in her own bathroom. Her family lived for years not knowing what happened to her, whether she had run away, whether she was alive somewhere. Marek Kaczynski, Joseph Balzano, Andrew Jakulis, Richard Leone, Solomon Stern. Each name represents a life ended, a story cut short, Some were criminals themselves, involved in the drug trade, living dangerous lives. But even criminals don't deserve to die the way Tommy's victims died. They don't deserve to be tortured, dismembered, buried in pieces in the woods. And these are just the identified victims. Law enforcement believes Tommy killed as many as 60 people. That means there are dozens of other victims whose names we don't know, whose families never got closure, who simply disappeared and were never found. They could be buried in other locations Tommy never revealed. They could have been dissolved in acid or thrown into the ocean. We'll never know. Judge Rena Raggi said it best. Nobody deserves to die as these people died. The families of Tommy's victims were devastated by the trial. Some attended every day, hoping to understand what happened to their loved ones, hoping for justice. The photographs shown in court, the descriptions of dismemberment, the clinical way prosecutors described finding body parts, all of this was traumatic for families already dealing with the loss of loved ones. Some families gave victim impact statements at sentencing. They described the holes left in their families, the years of not knowing, the agony of learning how their loved ones had died. Some expressed satisfaction that Tommy had been caught and would spend life in prison. Others said no sentence could ever be adequate, that Tommy had taken something irreplaceable and no punishment could balance the scales. Frank Ganji Jr., through his cooperation, gave at least 6 families some measure of closure. They learned what happened to their loved ones. They learned where the bodies were buried. They could finally hold funerals, could grieve properly, could begin the long process of healing. For families of missing persons, this closure is invaluable. The not knowing can be worse than knowing, the endless speculation about what happened, the inability to move forward. But there are still families out there, families of Tommy's other victims who never got that closure. They still don't know what happened. They still wonder if their missing loved one might someday come home. They don't know that their loved one is dead, killed by Tommy Pitera, buried in a location he never revealed. This is part of Tommy's legacy, not just the people he killed, but the families he destroyed, the holes torn in communities, the grief that continues decades later. Tommy Pitera's arrest and conviction came during a devastating period for the Bonanno crime family. The 1990s saw a systematic dismantling of the family by federal prosecutors, with multiple high-profile arrests and convictions that stripped away much of the leadership. The family had never fully recovered from the turmoil of the early 1980s, the Three Captains Massacre, the Donnie Brasco infiltration by FBI agent Joseph Peastone, the internal conflicts that had weakened the organization. By the 1990s, federal prosecutors, using RICO, Racketeer-Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act statutes, were systematically targeting mob leadership Joseph Massino, who had emerged from the Three Captains Massacre as the real power in the family and who eventually became official boss. Initially seemed untouchable, he was careful, rarely spoke on phones that might be tapped, insulated himself from the actual commission of crimes, and ran the family with an iron fist. But even Massino eventually fell in 2004. Facing overwhelming evidence and the prospect of the death penalty, Massino did the unthinkable for a mob boss. He became a cooperating witness. Joseph Massino became the first boss of a New York crime family to flip and testify against his former associates. It was a seismic event in the Mafia world, shattering the code of omerta at the highest level. If a boss could flip, anyone could flip. The old certainties that made men would never cooperate, that loyalty extended to death, were revealed as illusions. Tommy Pitera's case was part of this larger pattern of Bonanno family decline. His arrest removed a significant earner and enforcer. His drug operation had been generating substantial revenue, portions of which flowed up to family leadership. His reputation as a feared killer had been an asset, making potential enemies think twice about crossing the Bonannos with Tommy in prison. The family lost both his earning capacity and his enforcement capabilities. More broadly, Tommy's case demonstrated the effectiveness of federal prosecution strategies, the use of RICO statutes, the leverage provided by potential death penalty charges, the willingness to offer substantial sentence reductions to cooperating witnesses. All of these tools had proven devastatingly effective against the Mafia. The old ways of doing business were becoming impossible. Too many people were cooperating. Too many conversations were being recorded. Too much violence was attracting federal attention. The Bonanno family still exists today, but it's a shadow of its former self. The family that once controlled rackets throughout New York, that had influence in unions and construction and the waterfront, is now a much smaller, weaker organization. Federal prosecution, internal betrayals, and the changing economics of organized crime have all taken their toll. Tommy Pitera represented both the peak and the beginning of the end for a certain type of mafia operation. His brutality, his effectiveness, his earning capacity, these were all valuable. But his excesses, his psychopathy, his eventual arrest and conviction, demonstrated why the old model was failing. The Mafia had always used violence. But Tommy's level of violence attracted too much attention, created too much evidence, scared even fellow mobsters. The modern Mafia, to the extent it still exists, operates differently, lower profile, less violence, more focus on white-collar crimes and corruption. The era of the psychopathic hitman, the serial killer in the mob, largely ended with people like Tommy Pitera. Tommy Pitera's story has fascinated the public since his arrest, spawning books, television documentaries, and countless articles. The combination of elements: martial arts, the Mafia, serial killer psychology, brutal murders creates a compelling, if disturbing, narrative. The definitive book on Tommy's life and crimes is The Butcher, Anatomy of a Mafia Psychopath by Philip Carlo, published in 2009. Carlo was a respected true crime writer who had previously written about Richard Kuklinski, the Iceman, and Richard Ramirez, the Night Stalker. Carlo's book on Tommy drew on extensive research, including interviews with DEA agents, prosecutors, and people who knew Tommy. The book detailed the 4-year investigation that led to Tommy's arrest and conviction, providing insights into both the criminal operation and the law enforcement effort to bring it down. Carlo's book title, The Butcher, captured the essential horror of Tommy's crimes. It referenced both his dismemberment of victims and his cold, mechanical approach to murder. The subtitle, Anatomy of a Mafia Psychopath, framed Tommy as a case study, an example of what happens when psychopathic personality traits find an outlet in organized crime. The book became required reading for true crime enthusiasts and students of organized crime. It sits alongside other classic Mafia books: Wise Guy by Nicholas Pileggi, Underboss by Peter Moss, Murder Machine by Gene Mustaine and Jerry Capecci, as essential texts for understanding the reality of mob life. Stripped of Hollywood glamour, television also found Tommy's story compelling. In 2010, the biography channel series Mobsters devoted an episode to Tommy Pitera in its 3rd season. The episode, titled Tommy Karate Pitera, aired on December 25, 2010, and received positive reviews from viewers. The episode combined interviews with law enforcement officials, dramatic recreations of key events, and analysis by organized crime experts. It emphasized several aspects of Tommy's story that made it uniquely compelling. His unusual background as a martial arts expert in a world of street fighters, the stark contrast between his high-pitched voice and his brutal actions, the clinical, almost scientific approach he took to murder and disposal, and the bath story, which horrified even viewers familiar with mob violence. Tommy's story has also become a staple of true crime podcasts, with numerous shows dedicated to organized crime devoting episodes to his life and crimes. Podcasts like Mobland, the Mob Museum podcast, and others have analyzed Tommy's psychology, his methods, and his place in Mafia history. Online communities dedicated to true crime and organized crime history frequently discuss Tommy's case. Reddit communities like R Mafia and R True Crime feature regular threads about Tommy, debating various aspects of his story, sharing additional information, and analyzing his psychology. These discussions often compare Tommy to other mob killers, trying to determine where he ranks in terms of brutality, kill count, and psychological dysfunction. What makes Tommy's story particularly fascinating to these audiences is the cognitive dissonance it creates. The nickname Tommy Karate sounds almost comical, like a character from a martial arts movie. The high-pitched voice doesn't sound threatening. Even photos of Tommy show a fairly ordinary-looking man, not the hulking brute you might expect. But these superficial impressions clash violently with the reality of what he did, creating a disturbing disconnect that forces people to reconsider their assumptions about what evil looks like. Tommy's story has also found its way into academic contexts. Criminology courses studying serial killers and organized crime often include Tommy as a case study. He represents an unusual intersection, a serial killer operating within a criminal organization, using that organization's infrastructure to support his pathology. Most serial killers are lone operators. Most mob killers aren't serial killers in the psychological sense. Tommy was both, making him a valuable case study for understanding how different types of criminal behavior can overlap. The fact that Tommy maintains an Instagram account and sells artwork from prison has added a modern dimension to his story. True crime enthusiasts debate the ethics of this. Some argue he shouldn't be allowed any platform, that his crime should define him completely, that giving him an outlet to present himself to the public is inappropriate. Others argue that his artwork is separate from his crimes, that inmates engaging in productive activities is beneficial, that we shouldn't erase his humanity even though he committed inhuman acts. This debate reflects larger questions about criminal justice, redemption, and how society should treat its most violent offenders. Can someone like Tommy Pitera ever be more than his crimes? Should he be? These aren't easy questions, and Tommy's case forces us to grapple with them. Now I want to hear from you. What part of this story shocked you the most? Was it the bath with the corpse? The systematic way he buried bodies? The fact that even other mobsters feared him? Drop your thoughts in the comments below if you made it this far. You're clearly invested in these deep dive true crime and mob history stories. We have so many more coming your way, from other notorious hitmen to mob wars to the fall of the 5 families. Make sure you're subscribed with notifications on so you don't miss any of them. Hit that like button if you appreciated the depth and research that went into this video. It really helps the channel grow and lets me know you want more content like this. Share this video with anyone you know who's into true crime, mob history, or just fascinating psychological profiles of dangerous people. The algorithm loves when you share, and it helps us reach more people who appreciate this kind of storytelling. Before you go, let me know, what mobster or crime family should I cover next? The Gambinos? The Genovese family? Another notorious hitman? Your suggestions drive the content, so let me know in the comments. And remember, these aren't just stories. These are real events that affected real people, real victims. Real families destroyed, real evil walking among us. It's important we remember these stories, learn from them, and never forget the cost of violence. Tommy Pitera sits in a prison cell in Kentucky tonight, where he'll remain for the rest of his life. Justice was served, but it came too late for dozens of victims. Their memories live on, and by telling these stories, we make sure they're not forgotten. Thank you for watching this deep dive into the life and crimes of Tommy Karate. I'll see you in the next one. Until then, stay safe, stay curious. And remember, the real monsters aren't in movies. Sometimes they're walking the streets, hiding in plain sight. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications, new videos every day.